I stood frozen as the hotel room door creaked open. It wasn't my husband walking in, it was his best friend. "What are you doing here?" I stammered, clutching the sheet around me. His smirk sent shivers down my spine. "I think we both know why I'm here," he whispered, stepping closer. My heart raced as his gaze locked with mine. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a disaster waiting to happen. I never imagined my life could spiral into such chaos. My name is Lisa, and I'm 38 years old. For over a decade, I believed I had a picture-perfect marriage. My husband, Daniel, was everything I thought I wanted: successful, charming, and dependable. But over the years, his dedication to his career began to overshadow everything else. Nights spent alone in our large, empty house became a routine I couldn't escape. At first, I made excuses for him. "He's doing it for us," I would tell myself, trying to ignore the ache of loneliness gnawing at my heart. Our dinners grew quieter, our weekends less vibrant. The laughter that once filled our home became a distant memory. I often found myself scrolling through old photos, trying to remember when everything felt right. Then there was Aaron, Daniel's best friend. He was the kind of man who seemed to light up any room he entered. With his easy smile and quick wit, he was Daniel's polar opposite. Aaron had been around since college, always the life of the party, and a trusted confidant. But lately his presence started to feel different, heavier. I told myself it was nothing. "He's just being friendly," I thought. But the way his hand lingered on my shoulder during casual conversations, or how his compliments seemed to go beyond the polite, began to unnerve me. Still, I convinced myself I was imagining things too desperate for attention to see clearly. One fateful weekend, Daniel announced another business trip. "Just a few days," he said, brushing off my concerns with a quick kiss on the forehead. Aaron offered to drop by and check on me while he was gone. "To make sure you're not too lonely," he teased. His words felt innocent enough, but the glint in his eyes suggested otherwise. That Friday night, as the rain tapped against the windows, I found myself pouring a second glass of wine while Aaron sat across from me. The air between us was charged, and every glance felt like a silent conversation. The ache of neglect and the allure of forbidden comfort began to blur together in my mind. I had no idea that the cracks in my life were about to shatter completely. Aaron's visits became more frequent after that weekend. Each time he walked through the door, the atmosphere shifted. His charm was undeniable, but it was the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the room, that started to linger in my thoughts long after he left. I told myself it was harmless, that I was reading too much into it. But deep down, I knew something was changing. It started with small gestures. He'd brush a stray hair from my face, or lean a little too close when handing me a glass of wine. I would laugh nervously, brushing it off, but his gaze lingered. Every moment we spent together felt charged, and I couldn't help but notice how my heart raced in his presence. One evening, Aaron showed up unannounced. "Thought you could use some company," he said with that signature grin. I hesitated but let him in, convincing myself that it was better than sitting alone with my thoughts. As we talked, his questions grew more personal. "Are you happy, Lisa?" he asked, his tone soft but probing. The question caught me off guard. "Of course," I lied, forcing a smile. But the way he tilted his head, studying me, made me feel like he could see right through me. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words replayed in my mind. Was I happy? The question seemed simple, but the answer was anything but. Daniel's absence felt heavier than ever, and I realized just how lonely I'd become. My marriage, once filled with laughter and love, had become a hollow shell. And Aaron was filling that void in a way I didn't want to admit. The signs of something more were everywhere. Aaron would find excuses to touch me, a hand on my lower back as he passed by, a lingering hug that felt too intimate to be friendly. I started noticing how he would text me late at night, his messages always light-hearted, but with an undertone I couldn't ignore. "Thinking of you," one read. I stared at my phone for minutes, torn between guilt and an unfamiliar thrill. But it wasn't just Aaron's actions that were changing. I found myself looking forward to his visits, dressing up a little more, smiling a little brighter when he walked in. I started to wonder what it meant, this newfound energy I felt around him. Was it just a reaction to Daniel's neglect, or was it something more dangerous? Things escalated one rainy evening. Aaron came over to drop off something Daniel had left behind. We ended up sitting on the couch, the sound of the rain filling the silences between our words. He turned to me suddenly, his expression serious. "You deserve more, Lisa," he said, his voice low. My breath caught in my throat. "What do you mean?" I asked, but I knew exactly what he was implying. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. You deserve to feel seen, to feel wanted, he said softly. The vulnerability in his voice disarmed me, and for a moment, I forgot everything else, Daniel, the years of loyalty, the consequences. All I could think about was the warmth of Aaron's hand and the way his eyes seemed to pull me in. The guilt came rushing back as I pulled my hand away, standing abruptly. I think you should go, I said, my voice shaky. Aaron stood, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry, he said, but his eyes told a different story, one of longing, of patience. As the door closed behind him, I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding. I knew this wasn't over. The tension between us had reached a breaking point, and it was only a matter of time before something gave. The days that followed Aaron's last visit felt like walking a tightrope. My emotions swung between guilt and a growing pull I couldn't resist. I avoided his texts at first, hoping the space would help me sort out the chaos in my heart. But as each day passed, I found myself missing the warmth of his attention and the way he made me feel seen. Daniel, as always, was absorbed in work. His nightly calls were brief, filled with mundane updates about his meetings and travel plans. I'll be back in a few days, he'd say, as though that was enough to fill the void his absence left. I tried to convince myself it was, but Aaron's presence had awakened something inside me that refused to be ignored. The breaking point came one quiet afternoon. I was in the kitchen, absent-mindedly preparing lunch, when my phone buzzed. It was Aaron. Can I see you? Just to talk. I stared at the message, my pulse quickening. Every logical part of me screamed to say no, but my fingers betrayed me, typing, "Come over." When he arrived, the air between us was thick with unspoken tension. Aaron stood in the doorway, his usual confident demeanor replaced with something softer, almost hesitant. I didn't mean to make things complicated, he said as he stepped inside. I can't stop thinking about you, Lisa. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, I turned away, walking toward the living room. I could feel his eyes on me, and the weight of his presence made my heart race. He followed, stopping a few feet away. Tell me to leave if you want me to, he said, his voice low. But if you don't, I need you to know how I feel. I turned to face him, and the vulnerability in his eyes caught me off guard. For so long, I'd felt invisible, lost in the shadows of Daniel's ambition. But standing there, with Aaron looking at me like I was the center of his world, something inside me broke. This isn't right, I whispered, more to myself than to him. But it doesn't feel wrong, he replied, stepping closer. Before I could stop myself, I felt my hands trembling as he reached for them. His touch was gentle, hesitant, as though giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. The ache of longing, of wanting to feel alive again, overpowered every rational thought. Aaron's hands moved to my waist, his warmth seeping through the thin fabric of my blouse. Lisa, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Tell me to stop. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning closer, the space between us dissolving. His lips hovered near mine, and for a moment time stood still. The sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears as our gazes locked. Then, as though pulled by an invisible force, our lips met. The kiss was tentative at first, testing the waters of this uncharted territory. But as the moments passed, it deepened, a rush of emotions flooding through me, desire, fear, and a dangerous thrill. Aaron's hands moved up my back, pulling me closer as I surrendered to the moment. The walls I'd built around myself for years crumbled, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. We pulled away briefly, both of us breathing heavily. I've wanted to do that for so long, Aaron admitted, his forehead resting against mine. I closed my eyes, trying to process what had just happened. The weight of reality pressed against me, but so did the undeniable chemistry between us. This can't happen again, I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. Aaron nodded, but his hand remained on my waist. I know. But can you honestly say you didn't feel something real just now? His words struck a chord, and I hated that I couldn't deny it. Every fiber of my being told me this was a line I shouldn't have crossed, but the part of me that had been starved of affection craved more. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of stolen glances and hesitant touches. We danced around the line we'd already crossed, neither of us willing to fully confront the consequences. As Aaron left that evening, he paused at the door, turning back to look at me. I'll wait for you to figure this out, Lisa. But I need you to know, I'm not giving up. After he left, I sank onto the couch, my mind racing. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the memory of his touch, his words. For the first time in years, I felt alive, but the cost of that feeling loomed over me like a storm cloud. I knew this wasn't just about Aaron or Daniel. It was about me and the cracks in my own life that had led me to this moment. And I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and stolen moments. Aaron and I had crossed a line, and though I tried to convince myself it was just a fleeting mistake, the pull between us was undeniable. Every glance, every accidental touch seemed to carry the weight of all the things we couldn't say out loud. I felt trapped in a web of my own making, caught between the life I had built and the one I secretly longed for. Daniel returned home from his business trip, his usual routine of brief kisses and distant conversations resuming as if nothing had changed. But everything had. I found myself avoiding his touch, the guilt gnawing at me every time I saw his face. Yet even in those moments, my mind wandered to Aaron, the warmth of his smile, the intensity in his eyes. It was wrong, I knew that, but it was as if I had no control over my own heart. The breaking point came one fateful evening. Daniel had planned a dinner party, inviting a few close friends over to catch up. Aaron, of course, was among the guests. I could barely meet his eyes as he walked through the door, but I felt his presence like a magnet pulling me in. The room was filled with laughter and chatter, but for me it was as though time had slowed, every moment with Aaron magnified. As the evening progressed, I found myself alone in the kitchen, rinsing dishes while the others lingered in the dining room. I didn't hear Aaron come in until he was standing right behind me. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice low. I froze, gripping the edge of the sink. "You shouldn't be here," I whispered, not daring to turn around. "But I am," he replied, stepping closer. His hand brushed against mine as he reached for a glass on the counter, and the electricity between us was undeniable. I turned to face him, my resolve crumbling. "Aaron, this has to stop," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. He tilted his head, studying me. "Does it? Because I don't think either of us wants it to." Before I could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps jolted us apart. Daniel entered, smiling as though nothing was amiss. "You two okay in here?" he asked, oblivious to the tension. Aaron nodded quickly, his usual charm returning. "Just lending a hand," he said, stepping back. I forced a smile, my heart pounding as Daniel kissed my forehead, and returned to the others. The evening ended uneventfully, but the storm brewing inside me only grew stronger. The next day, I decided to put an end to it once and for all. I texted Aaron, asking him to meet me at a nearby cafe. "We need to talk," I wrote, my hands trembling as I hit send. When he arrived, the air between us was heavy with unspoken words. "Lisa, before you say anything, I need you to know how much you mean to me," Aaron began, his voice earnest. I shook my head, cutting him off. "This isn't about what we feel, Aaron. It's about what we've done. This can't continue. It's not fair to Daniel, or to us." He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "I can't live like this," I said, my voice breaking. "Every time I see him, I feel like I'm betraying everything we built together." Aaron's jaw tightened, his eyes searching mine. "Do you love him?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. "I don't know," I admitted, tears welling up. "But I know I can't keep doing this. It's tearing me apart." Aaron leaned back, his expression a mixture of pain and understanding. "If that's what you want," he said quietly, "I'll respect it. But I hope you find what you're looking for, Lisa." I left the cafe feeling hollow, but determined. It was time to face the cracks in my marriage and decide what I truly wanted. That evening, I planned to tell Daniel everything, to confess my feelings and the mistakes I'd made. But as I rehearsed the words in my mind, the decision was taken out of my hands. I returned home to find Daniel sitting in the living room, his laptop open on the coffee table. He looked up as I walked in, his expression unreadable. "Lisa, we need to talk," he said, his tone serious. My heart sank as I sat across from him, bracing myself for what was to come. "I found these," he said, sliding his phone across the table. On the screen were screenshots of text messages between Aaron and me, messages I thought I'd deleted. My stomach dropped as I realized what he must have seen. "Daniel, I can explain," I began, but he held up a hand, silencing me. "Don't," he said, his voice cold. "I trusted you, Lisa. I trusted both of you." The hurt in his eyes was unbearable, and I felt the weight of my actions crashing down on me. "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said, tears streaming down my face. "It was a mistake, Daniel. A terrible mistake." "A mistake," he repeated, his voice rising. "You call this a mistake? You betrayed me, Lisa. You betrayed us." The room was silent except for the sound of my sobs. I tried to reach for him, but he pulled away, standing and pacing the room. "I need time," he said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I don't know if I can forgive this. He left the house that night, leaving me alone with my guilt and regret. I sat on the couch, replaying every moment in my mind, wondering how it had come to this. The life I had built was crumbling around me, and I had no one to blame but myself. As the days passed, Daniel's absence was a constant reminder of what I'd lost. Aaron reached out once, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I knew I needed to face the consequences of my actions and figure out how to rebuild, if that was even possible. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The only question that remained was whether I could move forward, and whether Daniel would ever be willing to meet me halfway. The house felt emptier than ever. Daniel's absence was a painful reminder of the damage I'd caused. Days turned into weeks, and though he occasionally came by to pick up a few things, our interactions were brief and strained. He refused to talk about what had happened, and I couldn't blame him. What was there to say? The betrayal spoke louder than any words ever could. I spent my days replaying everything in my mind, trying to piece together where it all went wrong. Was it the years of neglect? The emotional distance between us? Or was it something deeper, something broken in me? The guilt was suffocating. I'd destroyed the trust that had taken years to build. And for what? A fleeting connection that left my world in ruins. Aaron, too, had distanced himself. He respected my decision to end things, but his absence stung more than I expected. I thought cutting ties would bring clarity, but instead, it left me feeling even more isolated. The pull I once felt toward him was still there, lingering like an open wound. But I knew that reaching out would only make things worse. I had to face this mess on my own. One evening, as I sat in the dimly lit living room, the weight of everything became too much to bear. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder of the choices that had led me here. I grabbed my phone, scrolling aimlessly until I found Daniel's contact. My thumb hovered over the call button, but I hesitated. What could I say that he hadn't already heard? Instead, I sent a simple text, "I'm sorry for everything." To my surprise, he responded almost immediately. "We need to talk." My heart raced as I read the words. I wasn't sure if I was ready for this conversation, but I knew it was inevitable. The next evening, Daniel came by, his expression guarded but calm. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared countless meals and memories. "Why, Lisa?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. "Why did you do it?" The pain in his eyes was unbearable, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I was lonely, Daniel. You were so focused on work, and I felt invisible. But that doesn't excuse what I did. I betrayed you, and I hate myself for it." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "I know I wasn't perfect," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "But I never thought we'd end up here." The room fell silent, the weight of our shared pain hanging between us. "Do you love him?" he asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said firmly, shaking my head. "I don't. What I felt for Aaron wasn't real. It was a distraction, a way to fill the emptiness I felt. But it was never love." Daniel nodded slowly, processing my words. "And me?" he asked. "Do you still love me?" Tears welled up in my eyes as I struggled to find the right words. "I do," I said finally. "I never stopped loving you, Daniel. But somewhere along the way, I forgot how to show it. And I think you did too." The honesty of my own words startled me, but they felt true. We had both contributed to the distance between us, even if my actions had ultimately broken us apart. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Daniel said after a long pause. "But I don't want to throw away everything we've built without trying." His words were a small glimmer of hope in the darkness, and I clung to them desperately. "I'll do whatever it takes," I promised, my voice shaking with emotion. "I'll go to therapy, counseling, whatever you need. I just want a chance to make things right." Over the next few weeks, we began the slow and painful process of rebuilding. Counseling sessions forced us to confront the cracks in our marriage, the moments we had ignored, the feelings we had buried. It wasn't easy. There were days when the hurt felt insurmountable, when the memories of my betrayal overshadowed any progress we'd made. But there were also moments of hope, small victories that reminded us why we had chosen each other in the first place. Aaron's name was never mentioned again, and I knew better than to reach out. I had made my choice, and though the consequences were painful, I was determined to move forward. Daniel deserved my full commitment, and I owed it to him, and to myself, to try. As time went on, the wounds began to heal, though the scars remained. Our relationship wasn't the same, and it probably never would be. But in a way, that was okay. We had both changed, and we were learning to navigate this new version of us. The trust we had lost would take years to rebuild, but we were taking it one day at a time. In the end, the affair wasn't just a breaking point, it was a wake-up call. It forced us to confront the flaws in our marriage and the ways we had failed each other. And while I would never justify my actions, I hoped that the lessons we had learned would lead us to something stronger, something more honest. Months passed, and life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. Daniel and I weren't the same people we had been before the affair, but maybe that was a good thing. The foundation of our marriage had been shaken to its core, forcing us to rebuild with honesty and intention. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of the past felt unbearable. But we kept going, one step at a time. Therapy became a lifeline for us. In those sessions, we learned how to communicate in ways we never had before. Daniel opened up about the pressures of his career and how he had buried himself in work to avoid confronting his own insecurities. I confessed the loneliness that had driven me to seek validation in someone else, a painful truth that I had been too ashamed to admit even to myself. Through these conversations, we began to see each other in a new light. Not as perfect partners, but as flawed individuals trying to navigate the complexities of love and life. The vulnerability was raw and often uncomfortable, but it also brought us closer in ways I hadn't thought possible. Slowly, trust started to rebuild, though it remained fragile. Aaron's presence lingered in my thoughts like a shadow, but I knew that chapter of my life was firmly closed. He had been a symptom of deeper issues, not the solution. I realized that the connection I had felt with him was a reflection of my own unmet needs, not a true bond. Letting go of that illusion was freeing, but it also came with a deep sense of remorse for the pain it had caused. One evening, as Daniel and I sat on the back porch watching the sunset, he reached for my hand. "Do you think we'll ever get back to how we were?" he asked softly. I looked at him, the man I had hurt but who had chosen to stay and fight for us. "I don't think we should try to go back," I replied. "What we had before wasn't perfect, and pretending it was is what got us here. Maybe we can build something better." He nodded, squeezing my hand. "Better," he repeated as though testing the word. It was a simple exchange, but it carried the weight of everything we had been through. In that moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. Not for a return to the past, but for a future where we could both feel seen, valued, and loved. The experience left me with lessons I'll carry for the rest of my life. I learned that love isn't just about grand gestures or fleeting passions. It's about showing up every day, even when it's hard, and choosing each other over and over again. I learned that neglect, whether intentional or not, can leave wounds that fester if left unaddressed. And I learned that forgiveness, both giving and receiving, is a process, not a single act. Most importantly, I learned the value of accountability. The affair was a choice I made, and I've had to live with the consequences. But facing those consequences head-on has made me stronger, more self-aware, and more determined to be the partner Daniel deserves. As we move forward, I know there will still be challenges. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight, and the scars of the past don't simply disappear. But there's a strange beauty in starting over, in finding new ways to love and support each other. It's not the story I thought we'd have, but it's ours, and for that I'm grateful. If there's one thing I'd want others to take away from this, it's that love is never perfect, and neither are the people in it. But with honesty, effort, and a willingness to face the hard truths, it's possible to create something meaningful, even in the aftermath of betrayal. And sometimes it's the hardest moments that teach us the most about who we are and what we truly want. If you were in Lisa's shoes, what would you have done? Do you think Daniel made the right choice by giving her a second chance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that delve into life's toughest choices. And stay tuned for next week's story. You won't believe what's coming next.